we are not reductionists by any mean. We're so anti-reductionism. But one thing I'll say is that you kind of predict Super Bowls based on what you know about addiction, and I feel like that's almost guru-y or something like that. But you were pretty confident, and you wound up being right. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you think per your article, the blog that you wrote about the Kansas City Chiefs and Andy
So we
Reid's
released
son.
a blog before the game that predicted the game. By the way, we might at times appear cheerful or even humorous talking about this story. It's a tragic story.
Yeah, yeah.
In many different ways, it's a tragic story. So please forgive us, dear viewers, if sometimes we crack a smile. But the Kansas City Chiefs went into the Super Bowl a strong favorite. And of course, they have a quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, who's beyond belief. He played the worst game of his career. He had never played a game in college or in the pros where his team didn't score a touchdown. They lost 31-9. They had 3 field goals. So that's remarkable. And they looked demoralized from the start. And the Chiefs had the best record in the NFL for the whole year. They were the defending Super Bowl champions. They went 14-1 in the playoffs. So this is beyond being their worst game ever. It was below beyond that. And we're going to explain, we talked about why that was going to happen, and now we'll explain why it happened. Mahomes wasn't the only perpetrator. The coach is Andy Reid. At the end of the first half, while the Buccaneers had the ball, he called a couple of timeouts while they were on defense because he was assuming they'd get the ball back and Mahomes would score before the half. And they were at the time behind 14-6, which is doable. But in fact, the extra timeouts he called allowed the Buccaneers and their great quarterback, Tom Brady, to go downfield. They only had a minute left. But then one of the defenders for the Chiefs tripped up a Bucs player. There was a penalty, interference penalty. They were all the way down, and they scored another touchdown. And now it was 21-6 at the end of the half, and the game was effectively over. So what happened? Somebody might have noticed the first thing that Andy Reid talked about after the game was this about, well, his son had been involved in an unfortunate accident. He can't talk about it. And, my heart and my prayer goes out to all the victims.
Yeah.
So, by the way, one thing we're going to talk about a little bit perhaps later in this broadcast, everybody's so proud about how there's no shame and no guilt around addiction now. We're going to talk about Jamie Lee Curtis making that statement. But in fact, they mentioned this accident one time during the game that I heard and one time in the pregame that I heard. But neither of those incidents, of those mentions, or Andy Reid's mention the fact that his son, Britt Reid, who's a 35-year-old assistant coach, outside linebacker, had been drinking. And we don't know all of what's happened yet because it's still in the middle of being adjudicated. It's a criminal case. It's a police case. But Thursday night prior to the Super Bowl, his son, Whit Reid, I think entering onto a highway, hit a car that was parked alongside the side of the highway. It had been out of gas. They called another car to help.
Britt Reid, right?
Britt Reid, thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. All help appreciated. And Britt Reid was driving that SUV. He plowed into the back of one of the cars, which had 2 small children in the back seat, 4 and 5 years old. The 5-year-old is in critical condition in a hospital. So, and Reed had been drinking. He admitted that. The police officer in the report said his eyes were bloodshot, and Reed admitted to having 2 or 3 drinks. We should mention perhaps now that he did have a DUI record in his record, and he had a previous drug involvement past. And in fact, he had a brother. Andy Reed had 2 sons. One died around drugs. So this time, this son, the remaining son, had a DUI, but he seemed to be largely recovered from it. He had become an outside linebacker coach. He was successful. So they were going into the Super Bowl with the coach whose son had been arrested, possibly for drunk driving, and critically injuring a 5-year-old baby. I think the baby was a child of color. I'm just judging by pictures. And nobody mentioned this. And I haven't seen any analysis after the game that's discussed this. How this was related to their performance, their unbelievable, below abysmal performance. But it's the only way to explain what happened. I just want to take a little side trip. I have seen no analysts who mention any of this. But I happen to have a dull life. You know, you've been to my apartment, and you know I live in a dull building in a dull neighborhood. But I had a friend for the Super Bowl who's a bartender. He's about your age, about half my age. And he's a popular guy. And on the way up on the elevator, he peered over his mask. And there was another guy in the elevator walking his dog back. And he goes, "Billy." So Billy's a friend of his. So at halftime, my friend went up to Billy and his girlfriend's place. And then afterwards, Billy came down and we had a post-game drink. And Billy's the only person I know who analyzed the situation in an interesting way. He said, "Can you imagine what the pregame pep talk was like?" Because, as I'll mention, players are studiously trained in a number of things now. You get into the NFL, and they have counselors come in and they say, "You know, there was a time when we could get you off of things like assaulting a woman. That can't happen now." And MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, quote, "We have a long-standing relationship with the Chiefs and working with the rookies and coming into their facilities and sharing our message and our resources on never to drive impaired," said Megan Carter, a director of field operations for MAD. So you're having a pregame prep talk with a coach whose son, a coach, has done what they've just been told, "Don't do this." And many of them are African American, obviously, the ball players. The injured party was a 5-year-old girl of color who's facing life-threatening consequences. What was that pregame pep talk like? And Billy, he's the only person I've known who's discussed that. He said, what must that have been like? They were demoralized. They were divided from the get-go. The coach, Mahomes, his father is African American. The whole team played like they were, well, you know, we don't usually talk in terms of trauma, but it wasn't like a childhood trauma, but they were still in shock.
Like a deer in headlights and down on themselves.
And I would think it was very divisive. It would be, you know, if you have a coach and, you know, he brings in people and says, "Well, listen, there's one thing that has to happen. It's that you can't drive drunk." And then his son drives drunk. What's how are the players going to react? I mean, he's not going to be a very good figure officially. So after Andy Reid actually brought it up first thing after the press conference, he said nothing. As I said, none of the analysts during the game, pre-game, or after the game mentioned that drinking was involved. So this raises a tremendous number of questions. One question it raises was, well, I guess the MAD lecture didn't do so well, unless maybe they didn't let the coaches attend it. But he had been in treatment before. He had had a DUI before, and he had had drug charges before. What do you think might have gone wrong in the MAD lecture, or that we might have done differently, do you think, if we were talking to people? We're referring now to our light process program, which is a harm reduction program. How would we approach the topic of drunk driving or driving while intoxicated?
Well, I'm thinking about my students at the high school now, and I know we've talked about this before, but just the resistance that they feel after being told that behaviors which they often exhibit are evil. I mean, they're demonstrably evil, egregious, and so of course they can't sign on the dotted line to that, and they can say that they agree with you, but then they have to isolate themselves or find people who will let them into their in-group for doing things they do. For instance, and we talk about in schools, they talk about vaping or using any sort of a drug, and they say, well, we're liberal and we're kind-hearted and it's a disease and we love you, but just so you know, if you ever even start to do these things, you're doomed. And so I imagine that there's sort of a doomed mentality when being given a presentation about drunk driving, drugs, things that maybe, it's within the range of normal, responsible human activity. Even if people don't do it anymore and they're responsible, they could have done that in their lives or have partaken or had drinks. And what are they supposed to think now? How is it constructive?
And those lectures tend to go from 0 to 100.
Yeah.
They say, well, you can never, with the students, they can tell them, well, you should never drink at all or certainly never get drunk. And what harm reduction is about, as we approach it, is in all of the, between 0 and 100, there are 99 stop points. And so a harm reduction lecture might be, well, you're adults, you might drink alcohol, so it's unlike a lecture you're allowed to give in a high school. But if you do, there's certain things that you really want to avoid because they could have life. Britt Reed's not going to get out from under this. I mean, the NFL's not going to reinstate him as a coach. A 5-year-old girl might be crippled. Lord willing, she's going to live. He's done something life altering. I wouldn't want to say life ending, career ending, but he's in a deep hole.
Yeah.
And how it'll affect the team going down the road, they might recover, by next year. They just lost one Super Bowl, which is a mini tragedy, Some of those players might never get another chance. Mahomes is going to be back. There's some guys who are just there for a year. But harm reduction is about avoiding the worst things happening.
Mm-hmm.
So you might say, well, you're not supposed to drink. We certainly don't approve of you getting intoxicated. But there's certain things that you need to prepare for not happening. In the life process program, we have it depicted as a train stop. For example, if it's somebody who's had a drinking problem, they may resolve to abstain. So the first stop is they have a drink, they didn't want to, you can get off there and not have another drink. Second stop might be, well, you have a few drinks, you can quit then. You can get off the next station. All right, let's say you drink too much and you become intoxicated. All right. There's certain things that shouldn't happen after that. And
we could even think about Britt. I've talked with clients who are in similar ruts where, you got to imagine that you could do things to make your situation worse. You can also do things to preserve your situation and improve on it, even if you feel like you're in deep. And what we would do is try to help people understand that it's worth it to think about improving those situations. So,
and also to give them a plan for it. So in other words, you're saying the thing we try to avoid is just because in for a dime, in for a dollar. Okay, I drank. Well, I might as well get drunk. Okay, I'm drunk. I might as well drive. You've got to break that line of logic, and you have to have a plan in place. And I don't know what they pay him, but he could get a ride home, and he should be aware that that's a reasonable thing to do. So,
but I'm saying even you get to the point that Britt Reed is now. I mean, I hope that someone, you would hope that he could think about how to avoid further loss and how to improve on the situation after he's dealt with the, sort of reckoning with what he's done, and that he's not in a good situation, but he could probably make it worse.
Well, okay, that's a good point. I mean, the last stop on the train station is, let's say you've done everything wrong. You've gotten drunk, you've gotten in your car, you've gotten arrested and lost your license, you can't work. Perhaps you've gotten in an accident. I mean, the last stop that you need to get off at is not going back to like whatever your worst state of alcoholism or drug addiction was. That can't happen, because that's not going to help you, and it's not going to help anybody else. But you're going to the final stop of the tragedy. You're saying he's already done something very, very bad. But God bless you. You're like a Christian saint. You're saying, even at the worst extremities of life, there is room to improve, and that's really important to tell people.
Yeah.
Obviously, mad, and we want people not to get to that point. And so, relapse. So that's what we're talking about, is two different. We're combining relapse prevention,
right,
and harm reduction. Relapse prevention, and one of the things that most often goes wrong with harm reduction, with relapse prevention or therapy at all, is how you began this discussion, by demanding perfectionism. Well, look, you shouldn't drink, and then there's no fallback. Well, let's think about. Are you aware of what who's the British woman who died, the singer? I don't want to go to rehab. What's her name?
Amy Winehouse.
Amy Winehouse. Are you aware of what she died of?
Oh yeah. I think likely, no, it is. It was tranquilizers and alcohol, and
he just got out of
drug
rehab.
mixture.
She wasn't a big girl, and I think she had about a point. She drank a bottle of. That's a bad way to go. She drank. She had tranquilizers from the treatment center that they give you so you don't drink. And what instructions did they give her? They said, "Well, don't drink."
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps that would have been a good idea for her, but then she drank, and then she went all the way on down all of those train stops. She drank, she kept drinking, she got drunk, she kept drinking, and she died. That's the opposite of harm reduction. And she had people.
Nobody would have ever said this to her, but you're saying to her at that point, don't go back to the one thing you've learned to rely on to help you, get the sensations that you seek in life. Whatever you do, don't do that. And without ways of coping.
And what we're saying is you have to put in some gradations there. You're tolerant of the fact, you're not judgmental. You're saying, well, what's your goal? We're not going to tell you not to drink. But on the other hand, we are going to try and work with you to keep you alive. That's our basic, fundamental number one goal. And then to keep you happy and successful and singing and in relationships. We're working our way back down and sort of working our way up.
Right.
But to tell her, don't drink at all, without recognizing, as you point out, well, she drank a lot of alcohol in her life. She was off drugs, by the way. And then not to prepare her to drink better in any way, drinking better even to the point of preserving her life. And so I don't know what they're both in terms of harm reduction, both in terms of prevention messages. They would tell a high school kid and they would tell her not to drink at all. And we would say, you have to have a plan for getting off of that train station before bad, really bad. I mean, very bad. I mean, if you drink and you get drunk, okay, could be a bad night, could be a bad weekend. But what we want to avoid is life-altering events, which Amy Winehouse had the worst example of. But Britt Reed is about to experience that himself. And of course, there's that poor girl who wasn't doing anything. And we don't know what the consequences for the team are going to be or for Andy Reid. Mm. This is a cataclysmic set of catastrophes. And just to take one step back, nobody that I saw no discussion of this. And everybody's always boasting. And I'm going to switch to another topic now. Another great moment in let's see. I'm going to talk to Jamie Lee Curtis. Jamie Lee Curtis on The Shameful Secret of Addiction, how the actress fights the stigma surrounding addiction. I would say most people in America would say now that we've become much more accepting of addiction and understanding of it. And we'll talk about what categories they put people in to do that. But I don't believe it. And the fact that not one person during Super Bowl Sunday, although it was mentioned, as I said, 3 times, discussed the alcohol part of all this, shows that they can't deal with it. They can't deal with it in a realistic way. I mean, somebody might have said at the time, well, you know, you can drink, but you shouldn't drink and drive. That would be how many 100 million? I don't know how many people watch the Super Bowl. So while we're always boasting about how accepting we are of addiction and alcohol and drug addiction, we're not. We can't deal with it. And you and I have had this discussion this way. Both of us has brought it up. We've said, well, why don't people want to discuss these complexities, why people act this way and all? Because it's too painful and complex. So it'd be great to say, maybe in a year or a couple of months, we'll say, oh, Britt Reed was an alcoholic. He drank. So you've put it in a safe category, which avoids the pain of imagining and discussing what happened. And at the same time, it avoids the advantage of actually trying to deal with something real that could help him.
Right.
And that's what happened. I mean, he's been in treatment. Britt Reed is an example of the failure of American treatment. He's been in treatment.